A car that sold new for AOD $4,000 just hammered for AOD $1.15 million at auction. That is not a typo. That is a Ford Falcon GTHO Phase 3, an Australian-built, Australian-designed machine, selling for nearly 300 times its original price. But here is the fact nobody tells you. Of the 10 Australian classics most likely to destroy your finances in 2026, that same GTHO is on the list. Not because it is worthless, because the market around it is now so dangerous, so full of fraudsters and clone cars, that the wrong purchase does not just cost you money, it ends you financially. Here's exactly what you need to know before you spend a single Australian dollar. Number 10, the Holden Tirana, LH and LX. The LH Tirana launched in 1974, the LX followed in 1975. These were Australian-designed performance cars that produced some of the most celebrated touring car racing results this country has ever seen. Peter Brock drove the LX at Bathurst. The A9X specification, LX Tirana, is a genuine piece of Australian motorsport history. The buying problem in 2026 is structural rust in specific. Difficult areas, lower quarters, floor pans, and the areas around the rear suspension mounting points. These are not surface rust issues. They are structural integrity questions. Rust in the rear suspension mounts on a car you intend to drive is a safety issue, not just a value issue. And remember, no airbags, no ABS, no crumple zones engineered to modern standards. A structurally compromised Tirana is a genuinely dangerous car on Australian roads in 2026. A9X replicas are documented throughout the market. Genuine A9X cars have specific build records and club verification processes. Do not pay A9X money for a car that cannot provide that documentation. The difference between a real A9X and a well-built replica is tens of thousands of AUD. That gap is exactly why replicas exist. Number 9. The Holden HZ Kingswood 1977-1980. The HZ was the last of the full-size Kingswood passenger car range before the Commodore took over. It introduced radial-tuned suspension, RTS, which genuinely improved handling over its predecessors. That is the good news. The bad news for buyers today is what has happened to surviving examples over 40-plus years. V8-powered cars are the most sought after and the most faked. Six-cylinder cars have been converted to V8 power as a cheap performance upgrade, then presented as genuine V8 HC models at V8 prices. A proper engine number check is not optional. Genuine V8 Premiers are now priced from ORD $20,000 to well over OHE $30,000. At those prices, buying an engine-swapped car without verification is a four-figure or five-figure mistake in Australian dollars. And on safety, the HZ has no airbags, no ABS, and drum brakes on the rear axle. In emergency braking situations on a wet Australian road, this car will behave nothing like any modern vehicle you have driven. Factor that in before you consider it as anything other than a weekend show car. Number 8. The Holden HQ, HJ and HX, Kingswood, 1971-1977. The HQ was Holden's most radical new car in decades. Released in July 1971, it sold over 452,000 units in 3 years. Performance versions, Monaros and GTS variants, are now approaching a UD $80,000 and beyond at auction. That price creates its own serious problem. Subframe swaps, to disguise stolen or cloned cars, are a documented fraud in the Australian classic car market. The serial number is stamped on the driver's side subframe rail. A GTS subframe fitted into a lesser car passes a visual inspection. It does not pass a proper Holden Club verification check by a high-performance HQ without that verification, and you are buying legal and financial exposure alongside the car. The HJ and HX models that followed carried their own complications. Post-1976 emission control engines are prone to difficult starting and rough idling at operating temperature. Power steering repairs cost upward of a UD $500, and leaks are common on aged units. Specific Premier trim pieces, wood grain console covers, and stainless embellishers are now so rare that dealers and restorers specifically hunt for new old stock nose, parts that have never been fitted to a car. Finding genuine nose Premier trim in Australia today can take years and cost significantly more than the parts originally retailed for. Rust on all three models attacks windscreen surrounds, wheel arches, cabin floors, and the lower firewall. These are not quick fixes, and they are not cheap ones. Number 7. The Ford Falcon XW and XY GTHO. The GTHO Phase 3 is possibly the most famous Australian car ever built. In 1971, it was the fastest four-door production car in the world. Just 284 production units of the Phase 3 were built, plus one prototype. That is the total, 284 cars. And verified examples have reached AUD $1 million and beyond at Australian auction. That number, minus 284, is exactly why the clone problem on this car is the most severe in Australian classic car history. A standard XW or XY Falcon can be purchased for a fraction of a GTHO's value and rebuilt to look externally identical. The difference between a genuine GTHO and a clone is in the build plate, the engine block numbers, the differential codes, and the complete documentation trail. If any part of that documentation chain is missing or inconsistent, you are not buying a GTHO, you are buying a very expensive ordinary Falcon. The Australian court system has heard cases involving GTHO fraud. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a documented reality in this market. On safety, the GTHO was engineered for speed at a time. When Australian road safety standards were a fraction of what they are today, no airbags, no ABS. At the speeds this car is capable of, those absences matter enormously. Number 6. The Ford Falcon XR and XT19661970. The XR marked the point where Ford Australia genuinely committed to designing and engineering the Falcon for local conditions. The XR GT is now a legitimate and serious collector car. The problem is what that collector status has done to the broader market. Clone cars, standard Falcons rebuilt to resemble GT specifications, are widespread and documented throughout Australia. Genuine XR GTs command prices that make the economics of cloning worthwhile. If the GT you are looking at does not have documented provenance, a matching build plate, and a verified chassis number, you are looking at a clone until proven otherwise. On the mechanical side, rust in the firewall and inner sills is the primary structural concern on surviving examples. Good quality chrome is increasingly scarce. Panel availability has narrowed every year as the supply of usable parts from wrecked donor cars diminishes. And like every car on this list, no airbags, no ABS, and handling characteristics. That will catch an unprepared driver completely off guard in an emergency situation on Australian roads. Number 5. The Chrysler Valiant AP5 and AP619, 6319, 66. These were genuinely Australian cars. AP stood for Australian production. On the AP5, only 6 sheet metal items were shared with the American version. Nearly 50,000 AP5 South sold in Australia, over 43,000 AP6 South in a single year. The Slant 6 engine is one of the most reliable engines Australia ever produced, capable of exceeding 250,000 kilometers with proper maintenance. Buy one today, and the problems are specific. Rust attacks the front subframe mounting points. This is structural. This requires a hoist inspection before any purchase. Inner sills rust through. Wagon tailgates rust from the inside and jam the window mechanism. Torsion bars crack or seize in their mountings. Replacement sets cost between AUD $650 and AUD $1,100 for parts alone. Cracked exhaust manifolds are almost universal on surviving examples. Chrome and stainless trim is difficult to find in Australia and expensive when you do locate it. No airbags, no ABS drum brakes, on all 4 wheels on early variants. As a daily driver on modern Australian roads, this car requires a significant adjustment in how you approach every single stop. Number 4. The Holden FJ1953-1956. The FJ was the second generation of Australia's own car, and it outsold everything that came before it. Over 130,000 units were built. It is now one of the most recognized shapes in Australian automotive history. An unrestored FJ in honest condition starts around AUD $15,000. A fully restored example in show condition can exceed AUD $60,000. The buying risk on an FJ is straightforward. Body and trim parts are increasingly difficult to source in Australia. Rust is the defining issue on every surviving example: sills, floors, firewall, boot floor. A restoration quote on a genuinely rusty FJ body will exceed the finished value of the car, unless you are doing the work yourself. Buy the best body you can find and pay more for it up front. You will spend less overall. As a daily driver, the FJ has no safety equipment whatsoever by modern standards. No seatbelt mounting points on the earliest examples, no collapsible steering column, no padded dashboard. This is a show car and a weekend car. It is not a commuter vehicle in 2026. Number 3. The Holden FX 482-151948-1953 THE. Car Prime Minister Ben Chifley unveiled in a concert hall in 1948 with an orchestra playing. Australia's very first mass-production vehicle, designed and built here. In 2026, a well-maintained survivor ranges from odd $20,000 to a UD $40,000. Rare early numbered examples have sold for significantly more at Australian auction. The mechanical package, the grey motor, the 3-speed gearbox, the suspension can all be rebuilt by specialists who still exist and still work on these cars. The body is a different story entirely. Rust is the single defining issue on every FX. If you are buying one that needs paint and panel work and you cannot do it yourself, get a written restoration quote before you commit a single dollar. That quote will tell you more about whether this purchase makes financial sense than any seller ever will. Safety equipment? There is none by any modern definition. The FX predates seatbelts as standard equipment. It predates every crash safety standard. Australia now applies to road vehicles. Weekend show car only. Number 2, the Ford Falcon 40, an XM 1962 to 1964, Ford Australia, worked urgently after the XK's problems became public. The XL arrived in 1962 with heavier suspension components and over 1,500 mechanical changes from the original XK. The XM followed in 1964. Together, these models represent Ford's serious attempt to build a Falcon that actually suited Australian roads and Australian conditions. Buy one today and inspect the roof gutters, the edges of every panel, the area around both windscreens, the inner wheel arches, and the boot floor. Some early Falcons rusted so severely that taillights fell onto the road during normal driving. Panel rubbers cost a UD $1,500 per set to replace. Chrome sourcing from within Australia is now genuinely difficult. Good sedans are priced from a UD $25,000. Futura hardtops are heading toward OD $70,000. That is serious Australian money for a car whose entire survival story is rust management. No airbags, no ABS, the vacuum-operated windscreen wipers slow to near uselessness at full throttle. That sounds amusing until you are driving in Queensland rain with no wiper movement on the glass in front of you. Number 1, the Ford Falcon, XK19601962, Australia's first locally manufactured Ford. Launched in September 1960, marketed with the specific claim that it was built entirely for Australian conditions. That claim was not accurate. The XK was a right-hand drive version of an American compact designed for smooth North American bitumen. It had no meaningful Australian road testing before launch day. The front ball joints failed within kilometers on Australian roads. Ford issued a recall. Strengthened Fairlane specification ball joints were retrofitted across the range, but early cars still carry the consequences. Of those original compromised front-end mounting points beneath their restorations, stub axles today are genuinely difficult to find in Australia. Original trim is virtually impossible to source in good condition anywhere in this country. Drum brakes on all 4 corners will surprise and frighten anyone expecting anything resembling modern stopping distances. No airbags, no ABS, no crumple zones, no collapsible steering column. The XK was engineered at a time when Australian road safety was measured by entirely different standards. As a daily driver in 2026, it is not a realistic proposition. As a collector piece, it is a landmark. Australia's very first locally built Ford, but as a purchase without complete mechanical inspection, documented restoration history, and a clear understanding of what parts now cost in a UD. It is the most expensive lesson on this entire list.